So today we are going to do chapter 6. Chapter 6 is the last chapter that is kind of your standard story. The court tales sort of end here. Chapter 7 does kind of represent a bit of a transition from the court tales into the apocalyptic section. So we'll have a little bit more kind of standard stuff next week-ish, but there's still that apocalyptic element that we'll have to get into. So chapter 6 of all the chapters, I think, is probably the easiest one in terms of content and questions and that kind of thing. So if we wrap it up a little bit early today, I'd like to start getting into a little bit of a conversation about what apocalyptic literature is, since we're going to be starting to work on that starting next week. But if we don't get to it, we can always hop into it next week. So not a whole lot of historical content details to give you this week. We talked last week about Darius the Mede and how he's not a real person historically, but he might be a reference to there were some King Dariuses in the Persian Empire, but that the very first king of Babylon under the Persians was not called Darius, he was called Cyrus. But perhaps there is a possibility that this Darius the Mede is referring to the kind of governor. They did call them kings, rather, the emperor was the one who controlled the empire, but then they would have these local kings who would be in charge of the regions. And so Darius the Mede might be referring to the Persian king, the Persian governor, who was assigned by Cyrus to be in charge of the Babylonian region of this sprawling Persian Empire. Because if you remember from the map, the Persian Empire was vast, not quite as vast as Alexander's Greek Empire, but pretty close. So there's a possibility that Darius the Mede is kind of the stand-in for that person, and that would make more sense. It wouldn't make sense to have Cyrus present in these stories because he's the emperor of this entire empire, and he wouldn't house himself in Babylon like the others did. He would house himself in Persia, and so he would have someone kind of to rule in his stead in Babylon, which was far, far away from the seat of power for him. So kind of this local power is what's represented in this chapter. So that's pretty much all I've got as far as introduction. So we can just hop straight in unless there are any questions about anything that's going on. Any questions, comments, nagging thoughts? All right. Well, then let's look at chapter 6. Chapter 6 has 28 verses, so we could probably do 2 or 3 people on this, depending on how long people want to read. Any volunteers to get us started today?
I'll start.
All right, thank you, Karen.
I'm going to read from the Message today, too, which is a contemporary or a modern language. Darius reorganized his kingdom. He appointed 120 governors to administer all the parts of his realm. Over them were 3 vice-regents, one of whom was Daniel. The governors reported to the vice-regents, who made sure that everything was in order for the king. But Daniel, brimming with spirit and intelligence, so completely outclassed the other vice-regents and governors that the king decided to put him in charge of the whole kingdom. The vice-regents and governors got together to find some old scandal or skeleton in Daniel's life that they could use against him, but they couldn't dig up anything. He was totally exemplary and trustworthy. They could find no evidence of negligence or misconduct. So they finally gave up and said, "We're never going to find anything against this Daniel unless we can cook up something religious." The vice-regents and governors conspired together and then went to the king and said, "King Darius, live forever. We've convened your vice-regents, governors, and all your leading officials and have agreed that the king should issue the following decree. For the next 30 days, no one is to pray to any god or mortal except you, O king. Anyone who disobeys will be thrown into the lion's den. Issue this decree, O king, and make it unconditional, as if written in stone like all the laws of the Medes and the Persians. King Darius signed the decree. When Daniel learned that the decree had been signed and posted, he continued to pray just as he had always done. His house had windows in the upstairs that opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he knelt there in prayer, thanking and praising his God. The conspirators came and found him praying, asking God for help. They went straight to the king and reminded him of the royal decree that he had signed. Did you not, they said, sign a decree forbidding anyone to pray to any god or man except you for the next 30 days, and anyone caught doing it would be thrown into the lion's den? Absolutely, said the king, written in stone like all the laws of the Medes and Persians.
Do you want me to continue?
Sure, Joan.
Did you leave off on 12, so I should start on 13?
Yes.
Okay. It's kind of hard to distinguish with
I know.
Your version is just a little different than mine.
I know.
Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to the King Darius and said to him, Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issued can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. He could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, May the king live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all nations and peoples of every language in the earth, May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
All right. So, compared to some of this other stuff we've got going on, not too bad. Where would we like to start on this one?
You know what caught me was in verse 24, it says, that the king's command, men who falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown. Well, they didn't actually falsely accuse him, they accurately accused him. They just set him up.
That's true.
But then not only were they killed, but their wives and children.
Mine says
Yeah, that
malicious.
doesn't seem
I
very fair.
know.
Kind
Yeah.
of gruesome.
Life was cheap then.
Mm.
That was,
Says
that was-
that they maliciously accused Daniel.
Yes.
Effective. Okay.
yeah, that's a Persian custom. In my notes is what it says. In accordance with the Persian custom, along with their wives and children.
I mean, to some degree, they may have thought of that as the more humane way to go, because if your breadwinner, if the man of your house is killed, then you have nothing. You're on the street. You have no home. You have no one to protect you. You have nothing. And so, there's a possibility that that would be considered to be lenient, not to leave the children and the wife alone to starve to death on the street, basically.
More humane.
Yeah.
I'm glad I don't live at that time.
Must have been a lot of lions that eat that many people.
Yeah.
First they
Been
just
hungry.
crushed. Save them for later.
Yeah, I
That was
like
the
the,
part,
no, go ahead.
the old movies that they used to do where they fed the Christians to the lions, in the arenas and stuff. When
Mhm.
I was a kid, there were a lot of movies like that.
Yeah.
Covatus, and I can't remember the names of all of them, but every time they herded those Christians out into that arena and the lions went after them, I just got so upset.
Mm,
I couldn't understand why somebody, just because they were a Christian, was going to be eaten by a lion,
mhm.
And this is the same thing. It's like Daniel was being faithful to God and praying and practicing that, and he was going to be punished in the same way. I mean, they didn't change things over the years.
Mhm.
They fed a lot of people to lions.
The commentary I have in this relates to the story about pride. Pride, it says. It says, those who are slaves to pride do anything to maintain the illusion that they are more capable, more worthy, and more significant than others. Pride prompts people to do any number of horrible acts to those they think are lesser beings than themselves. Pride is the original sin.
Mm,
I didn't even look at it as a prideful thing that the others were doing to Daniel.
Yeah.
I thought it was more of a jealousy rather than a pride, that he was getting more favor. And this commentary said that it's pride.
Well, certainly the guys who tricked the king preyed on his pride to get him to sign that edict in the first place.
Yes.
I do find it interesting, though, that several times throughout it says, that the king has the ability to make the law, but the king does not have the ability to change the law once it's made. I find that to be interesting. Kind of reminds me of a class that I took in seminary where we had a small group discussion one time over the question, can God create a rule for how the world works or how things ought to work that limits God? Can God self-limit? And we kind of compared it to, can a lawmaking body, can Congress legislate limitations of its own power? Does that work? Because if they can make that law, they certainly could limit themselves, but if they decide that they don't want to be limited anymore, then don't they have the power to just remove that law? They put it in place. Why can't they remove it?
Yeah. Make a new law to trump the old law or.
Right.
Pretty soon we have lots of laws that nobody even knows about.
Yeah, that's why we've got all these weird laws that are still in the books.
Yeah, because they don't ever take anything out.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like it.
So I just wonder, you know, okay, so he can't change that. He can't change the actual law he signed. Well, why can't he make a new law that says, you know, sure, you still have to follow this law, but now here's a little kind of caveat on that law. Call it a clarification rather than a change.
Well,
Yeah.
isn't that what he does at the end? Where he says, you know, I decree that Daniel's God shall be worshipped in all parts of my kingdom. I mean, isn't that a new law
Yeah.
Yeah,
that over
that's true.
supersedes the other one?
Yeah.
Well, this commentary goes on after talking about the pride. Pride before God is absurd as well as deadly. The Lord sustains the humble, but casts the wicked to the ground, says Psalm 147:6. And that's exactly what happened in this story. While Daniel lived on in good graces of the king, the prideful governors were thrown in the same hole they dug for Daniel. The cure for pride is cultivating humility. Humility is being honest about who we really are before God. Humility is recognizing who God is, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. Being empty before God is the only way he can fill us up with himself. And this is the commentary on in my book. I think it's the Women's New International Version,
Okay.
Woman's Study Bible. I never thought of this, like I say, as pride and jealousy, but it sure brings it to light that that's what the governors had, and the king was very prideful.
Mm-hmm.
The governors were very jealous.
Mhm.
I noticed that Daniel didn't give too much forgiveness either.
Didn't give forgiveness.
Forgiveness to the people that wronged him.
Well, he didn't say anything about them, did he? He let the
No,
king
he
take care
didn't.
of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was just taken out of the den and then the others were tossed in. Nobody asked his opinion. Of course, nobody asked his opinion last week either with the putting the robe on him and all that stuff. He said he didn't want it and they put it on him anyway. So maybe he's learned his lesson and just decided not to say anything because nobody listens to him anyway.
Katie, how old would you say Daniel was at this time?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think of all the stories in here, this one to me seems the least holds up to the least amount of reason and logic pressure. So I feel like this one is definitely, you know, if you want to think of any of the other ones as historically accurate, I don't think that this is the one you want to go with. Because, you know, like we said, it kind of doesn't really even hold up to the tiniest bit of reason being thrown at it, that how come the king can change the law at the end of the story but can't change it in the middle of the story? Well, because the plot demands it, you know. So I don't think that this one actually happened. But certainly in terms
So
of
is the
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
so is the point of this story, or this section of the story, being it's not factual or historical, regarding the pride and the jealousy? Is that the point?
I think we're
that
right
God
back.
saves, or
I think we're right back again. You know, we talked about that chiastic structure last week, where this story parallels chapter 3 with the three friends that get thrown into the fire. And so the themes there, I think, have to do with the you know, the faithfulness of God and our need to be faithful to God to the best of our ability, regardless of the situation that we're in, regardless of the suffering that we might face, regardless of the dangers that we're to put our faith in God and to lean on God's, God's will for our lives. So I think that's probably where we are with this. But to Rich's question, in terms of, the timeline, even if we're not, assuming that Daniel is a real person, if there was a young man, maybe he's, at that time, young man was a lot younger than it is today. Even if he was 12 years old in 587, brought to Babylon and chosen because of his strength and wisdom to grow up into this position, then you get through the time that happens in terms of the historical timeline. So it's 587 when the Babylonians take over Jerusalem and destroy Jerusalem and take everybody into exile. And then we go through this history with Nebuchadnezzar and on into the time of Nabonidus and Belshazzar. And it isn't until 539 that we get Cyrus the Great coming in. And so if this is supposed to be happening after the Persians have taken over, then we're probably talking, 538, 537, maybe at that point. And so we're looking at 50 years since the fall of Jerusalem. So it's possible, in terms of lifetime, and especially if he was a very young man, like 12 years old, he would be in his early 60s at this point. So it's possible that someone who came from Jerusalem into exile in 587 would still be alive at the point of the Medo-Persian takeover. So it's not impossible that there could be one person who survived through all of that history and is still living in Babylon. But you notice it's interesting that, if we're taking Daniel as kind of the example of the upright Jew, the Jew who does everything right in exile, even after Cyrus comes in and allows them to return home, he doesn't go. He's still in exile. He's still living in Babylon. So that's an interesting kind of juxtaposition against what we see in some of the books like Ezra and Nehemiah, where the most important thing is to return. The most important thing is to reestablish the land that God gave to us and the temple for God to be with us. But this example of Daniel kind of undermines that a little bit and says, hey, you can still be faithful to God and still be in relationship with God outside of Judea, even after everybody's allowed to return. So that's kind of an interesting commentary on that assumption.
Katie,
Yes.
Reading ahead a little bit in the next book, they refer to the beast, one of them being the lion, and there's an association that was, Babylonia. Would Daniel going and surviving in the lion's den with that thought ahead, meaning he survived living in Babylon because of his faith?
Yeah, that could be kind of a second level commentary here, that he made it all the way through being among the lions. In my Babylonian period presentation that I put on YouTube, you see there's the Ishtar Gate with all the animals printed on it, and there's a lot of lion imagery in Babylon. A lot of, especially lions that are kind of mixed with other animals, griffins and what's the other one that has a lion? Griffins are the ones that have the lion and the eagle, and then there's a lion and a something else. I don't remember, but lots of lions appearing. So definitely the lion is kind of the state animal, if you will, of the Babylonian Empire. So that could be a way to interpret this story as a summary of the whole experience, certainly.
Well, there's sections throughout this chapter, like in verse 10, keeping the faith in your God.
Mm-hmm.
Then, in 22, God protects us. And then, in the king's new decree in 26 and 27, just a reminder of God's attributes and promises that are made to us.
Made and kept.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it kind of interesting that in most of these chapters, there's the confrontation, right? That Daniel is brought before the king, or the three friends are brought before the king, and the king says, "Hey, I heard that you're not doing this thing that I said you were supposed to do. What's going on?" And then the person has the chance to say, "Oh yes, so king, I appreciate you, but I'm really sorry I can't do this thing that you want me to do because it violates my religion." And then the king either gets really angry and throws a hissy fit, or in this case would not throw the hissy fit, but would say, "Well, I'm really sorry, but that's how it is." But in this story, we don't have that interaction. We don't have Daniel coming before the king to kind of defend himself. Just as when the king heard the charge, he was very much distressed, and he tried to save Daniel, but the conspirator said, "Hey, there's nothing you can do here. You're not allowed to change the law." And so the king gave the command, and Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. And so there's no situation where Daniel comes and says, I'm going to be faithful to my God. It's just, this is how it is. And so it to me kind of even emphasizes more heavily the focus on God as the one who is being faithful, and not necessarily Daniel. Now, certainly Daniel is behaving in the way that you would expect him to after we've learned all these different character traits about him for the last 5 chapters, but he doesn't speak it in the same way that we see in other chapters, where he's actually brought before the king and told, given words of expressing his faithfulness to God, and saying, "Oh, well, I'm going to interpret this dream for you, but I don't want to take credit for myself because it's my God who's doing it." Or the friends who come and say, "I know that the punishment for this is to be thrown into the fiery furnace, but we're not going to do it. So go ahead and throw us in because we have faith in God that God will save us. And even if God doesn't, we know that God's will is going to be done no matter what." And in this case, none of that happens. It's all kind of in the background. So I think the emphasis on God being faithful to God's people more so than the people being faithful to God is definitely highlighted here.
Yeah.
So you don't feel that pride and jealousy and humility have much to do with any of this?
I think that's an element of it for sure, because when we're reading these things, we want to figure out, what is this saying to us? But I think for the entire book of Daniel, I would say if you had to choose kind of one theme for the whole book of Daniel, it wouldn't be we need to be faithful to God. It would be God is faithful to us.
Yeah.
It's about what God is doing more so than what we are doing. And so
God's protection and shelter and sovereignty.
right. God is in control is the message. I think that if we were only allowed one message, I think that would be the one that the writer or the compiler of Daniel would want us to take away.
And then the others are just kind of side points
Yeah, kind of secondary things that you can get to.
on your behavior and how you should behave and
Right.
not behave. And
Right. And that kind of fits into the apocalyptic elements of this, which we can get into here for a little bit if we want to. that when you're looking at what feels like the end of the world, when you're talking about, you know, the destruction of your faith, the destruction of everything you've ever known, is it more important to police how people are behaving, or is it more important to help them to understand what's happening in relationship to God, to help them find God in that situation? And we saw that, you know, we see that even outside of apocalyptic literature in like the letters of Paul. Paul doesn't do a whole lot of talking about how we ought to live our lives, how we ought to behave, because he thought that Jesus was coming back tomorrow. You know, he wasn't that worried about how we structure ourselves and how we organize our institutions and who's going to be in charge of what within churches, because he didn't think it would be that long. We wouldn't have time to do that. The most important thing for him was being ready, because it's coming any second. So if you're in a situation where it's the end of everything you've ever known, are we trying to tell people how they should live their lives? No, because that's irrelevant. We've moved past that. You know, we're not trying to create structured society anymore. There is no more structured society, at least from the perspective of the worst case scenario that some of these people were looking at when they were reading these passages. So does that make sense?
Paul did tell us, Romans is full of it is how do we live our individual lives. I think what you're talking about is the church and the setups and the long-term laws.
Yeah, and certainly Romans is a much later of Paul's letters, and so, you know, over the course of his writing, over the course of his ministry, you get more of that. Like First Corinthians has a lot of, hey, look at how you're treating each other. You need to be acting in this way, not this way, and things like that. But there's not that long-term, how are we going to structure ourselves? How do we understand these big questions? You know, that kind of thing wasn't important to him, because he felt that by the time we figured it out, Jesus would return anyway, so it didn't matter.
Already here. Right.
Anything else on Daniel chapter 6?
You know, I've been looking at the last part in my message here, and it says that Daniel's God is the living God, world without end. His rule continues eternally. He is a savior and rescuer. You know, those talking about what God does and how he's always with us, you know, without end, and his kingdom never falls, and eternally. I mean, those words sound almost New Testament. You know, I mean, they almost jump to that part of it, of everything of the story. And I think it's interesting that back here where they were doing all this stuff, they didn't use words. I guess they used words like that. I don't know, because I don't have the other one open. But to say he's a savior and a rescuer and always here without end, I just found that really interesting, that even back then they would be saying those things.
Yeah, my translation says, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. So certainly those are images that we're familiar with.
Yeah. But I think it reinforces what you said, Katie, about how it's not about us, it's about God. It's about what God does, you know.
And how important that particular message is to people who are having a hard time seeing that because of the circumstances that they're living in.
Right. It really supports that.
Other insights, things to point out, questions? Well, why don't we then spend a few minutes starting to talk a little bit about apocalypse, just kind of in general. We're not going to get into chapter 7 at all. We'll save that for next week. But I just need to talk to you a little bit about what apocalypse is, because I think that our culture, interestingly, has kind of grasped onto this idea a little bit. We've got movies called things like Apocalypse Now and things like that, that don't understand what apocalypse was originally intended to be, at least in terms of apocalyptic literature in religious texts. So the word apocalypse is Greek, and it just means revelation. So the final book. Sorry, did somebody have? We're gonna have to. Oh, okay. Ben wandered off. So the final book of the New Testament, we call it Revelation. It's called Apocalypse. That's all it's called. It doesn't have any other name. And and Revelation is kind of a a revealing, a coming to some kind of new knowledge or understanding of something. In this, it's the same. The idea of revelation kind of is the same for them as it is for us today.
Yeah, that's real easy. In fact, it keeps dropping
To some
down.
degree, the sky opens up and the information comes to you, or metaphorically, the sky opens up and your light bulb goes off. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about in terms of apocalypse. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by Ben over there.
Hey, Ben,
What?
you're on camera, you know?
Yes, I know.
And so is your friend.
Yeah, so's your friend.
Well, they have an electrical problem, and they have to go through my attic.
Okay.
Uh,
So apocalypse
was
is Revelation. Now who's
What a
making
zoo.
noise?
There goes Karen. Okay, you're losing your.
Yes, I am. So apocalypse, and I'm losing my train of thought here too. So apocalypse is not just a reference to the end of the world as we kind of understand it today, with the Apocalypse Now, with the apocalypse movies, with the end of the world, the day after tomorrow, and all these kinds of things. Apocalypse doesn't really have anything to do with that, and it's in its original form. It's an original understanding of what that word means. Apocalypse has more to do with the way that scholars like to talk about this is it has more to do with forthtelling than with foretelling. And so foretelling is kind of the crystal ball stuff, telling us what's going to happen in the future, giving us the fortune from your fortune cookie kind of stuff. That's not what apocalypse is. Apocalypse is about
Fiona, no.
About explaining, interpreting events to help us understand why they are happening in the context of our faith. Forthtelling. And so I think it's more helpful to compare apocalypse to prophecy in the Old Testament than it is to compare apocalypse to those crystal balls and things like that. So in the Old Testament, prophecy was, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, they would get up and they would share God's message to the people. They would tell them that, that they see what's going to happen here. And I don't think it was anything that they needed. They didn't need any kind of special information or special insight from God to see the writing on the wall, haha, so to speak, that they could see that the way that people were being treated in their society was going to lead to some kind of revolution of some kind. And so, you know, for somebody like Isaiah, I mean, certainly you don't want to be the person to do this because you get into a lot of trouble, but to tell the truth about what's going to happen because of the way that you're living your life, to tell the truth to those who are in power is, I think, what prophecy is about. And so the Old Testament prophets were there to express to the people in power in Judea what was going to happen if they didn't change their ways, if they didn't turn to God and do what God wanted them to do, and stop behaving in ways that were selfish and put people down and created conditions that weakened the cultural fabric, weakened the political fabric, and exposed them to these other external powers that could take advantage of those vulnerabilities because the society wasn't strong, because they were not taking care of the people on the ground, you know, the people at the bottom of the barrel. And so that's what prophecy is. Prophecy is about telling the truth to powerful. Apocalypse, on the other hand, is about telling the truth to the oppressed. So if you are the person who's in charge, if you are the king of Israel or the king of Judea, king of Judah at that time, then you have a prophet. Someone gives prophecy to tell you, hey, here's what's going to happen if you don't shape up. Apocalypse is telling the truth to people who have no power, to give them hope, to tell them, hey, this is how we're interpreting events in relationship to God. And this is why you should have hope that even though right now things are not great, they will get better because God is in control. And whether or not they get better in your lifetime, it doesn't matter, because we can trust that God knows what's going on and God's gonna make what needs to happen happen. So prophecy, telling truth to power; apocalypse, telling truth to powerless. But you notice that neither of those things really has anything to do with guessing or knowing what the future is going to hold. And the idea that, you know, that's what it's about, I think, takes away the power of prophecy and apocalypse, because there is that element, and I'm not, you know, I don't want to take that away entirely. I don't want to suggest that there is no validity to looking at some of these things and saying, hey, I can see, you know, some parallels between these images and what's going on in our own world today, or I can see some parallels between these images and what was happening during World War II, or, you know, during any kind of era of generalized oppression in world history. And certainly even as things continue to develop, new people will come up with new interpretations for how to apply these things to their own circumstances. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But again, like when we were talking about with Joan, the idea that Daniel is about God's sovereignty first and foremost, and then there are some other things we can do with it. I think apocalypse, we have to remember, it's first and foremost about telling the truth to the oppressed, bringing hope to the oppressed, and then anything else that we want to try to do with it otherwise, about figuring out what's going to happen next in the world and things like that, is secondary to that message. So what kind of questions do you have about that? I know this is a very different understanding of what apocalypse is about than our culture generally accepts.
Yeah. It's going to take some digestion because it's new.
Yes.
When might that have changed, that perception of the term?
How did it change? Sorry, you kind of broke up.
How or when?
Oh, I don't know exactly, but I would imagine that it's because of that penchant for looking at these stories as applicable to me, to my time, or to something that I am familiar with, that I think would would make it seem like it was about the future. And you know, even the very first people who were looking at the book of Daniel in its finalized form here, we talked about, I believe at some point we talked about, or if we didn't, it's definitely in my video about the Greek period, that they believe that Daniel, as it's written, and we talked about, you know, it started out with these oral stories that were circulated orally, and then somebody wrote down one piece and somebody wrote down another piece, and it kind of developed over the course of time. It wasn't until 163 that it was finalized in this form that we have today. That's a long time. You know, even if you give them 100 years from when the original sack of Jerusalem occurred in 587, that's 487. So you're talking about, you're still talking about 600 years from when, or no, sorry, I can't do math. 500 to 200 is 300 years, 350 years for this to slowly develop. So that's a long time for all of this to happen. But if you're saying that, you know, if you read it in a literal way, that Daniel, these visions are attributed to Daniel because they fit into this story about Daniel, and then you are using those images, those visions to interpret what's happening in 163, then already you've got that kind of secondary layer of, well, how was Daniel supposed to know what's going to happen in 400 years? He must have gotten some kind of message from God that told him what was going to happen.
Unknown caller.
So I think from the very beginning of Daniel, you know, being as we've got it set up, we already have that sense that if you don't look at the story from the perspective of the frame being created for the purpose of literary continuity, creating this character Daniel so that the whole story is about Daniel, and understand that it's not meant to be history. It's not meant to be historically accurate. Some of it is historically accurate, but that's not important. That's tertiary at best in terms of the point of the story. If you don't remember that, then it's really easy to say, hey, how come Daniel knew about this stuff? Well, God must be telling him what's going to happen in the future. And now all of a sudden we're obsessed with the future and wondering what the future is going to hold. And oh, well, now we've got all these clues about what the future might hold. And so now we're going to spend all of our time looking at that and forget completely about what this was originally intended to be about. I think it's just human nature that we want to know the unknown. And if we think that this might contain something that helps us out with that, then we're immediately going to go there.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, we're always trying to analyze or figure out what's going on, you know? It's hard to just trust that it's all going to be okay.
Yeah, impossible, actually. And sometimes, which is why this is
we always have to figure it out, you know.
I think what, like I said, I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to look at this stuff and say, oh, well, this might refer to this and this might refer to this, and what does this mean, and how is this going to, you know, shape out into our future? I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but what it does do if we forget the original intention is it takes away that message of hope. You know, it turns it into a puzzle that we're trying to solve rather than a source of assurance that God is in control and God is there and providing for troubling times. And so, you know, when you are in the position of power, when you are comfortable, when you don't have to worry so much about what's going on in your culture or in your own life, and you look at this stuff, it's easy to fall into that, oh, well, you know, obviously let's use this as an interesting puzzle about what's going to happen next. But then if you kind of live in that too much, then when you do have troubling times for yourself or for your culture in general, for your community, then you forget that this is really this is the time that this is written for you, not in those other times. Lots of mulling faces going on here. I think
Yeah.
did
Yes,
I
yes.
break something?
I'm just thinking, I don't really want to share this, but I will. A few years ago when Walking Dead was really popular when it first started, my grandson, who's 20, he'll be 22 this year, but he started watching it, and to have a link with him, I started watching some of it, and once I got past the part that the zombies were already dead, so it didn't matter that they got dead again, then I could watch it with a different viewpoint. And one of the things that I really appreciated about it, and I watched it for several seasons because of it, was that the group of people that the show was about lived in hope. And one of the things that became a very strong message was that they didn't give up on their faith or their community or their sense of family, their humanity, And there was a character who he was an older man, and he sat and read the Bible all the time and talked to them about how they had to hold on to that part of them that was good because it gave them hope that there may be a future, that there may be a way out of it. So when you're talking about apocalyptic being hope, giving people who don't have any hope, I'm sorry, that's just the image that came in my mind. My brain does weird things. But
I think it's pertinent.
I finally had to stop watching the show because it got really violent and ugly, and I mean more so than it was. And but all the way through the parts that I watched, these people trying to do good and trying to help people and hanging on to the hope that maybe the future was going to be better and that they would survive. But if they survived and they'd given up everything that made them good, what did they have? So I that message of hope came through real loud and clear in that. It's a weird show, but
Yeah, no, I think that's important, and certainly in times of that kind of, it, I think something that's important, and I keep saying, when you have issues in your own life, when you have concerns and feelings of powerlessness and oppression in your own life, that this can be a source of comfort for you, and that's certainly true. But again, I want to just make sure that we're clear that this is about community hope. This is about community, community powerlessness and kind of the big picture of the sweep of history is what we're looking at here. And so the best, the best, unfortunately for us in the 21st century, the best kind of analog to this is World War II, and people talk about that a lot. But that's kind of the same thing, that all of society is completely destroyed, and everything that we ever knew was true about humanity and about how we ought to live our lives and about how we treat each other and about the assumptions that we can make that when we get up in the morning, the same coffee shop that we like to go to is going to be there and available to us. Those are the kinds of things that I think undermine our ability to feel human and to remember who we are and whose we are. And so I think that this is relevant to us now, because how much of that has changed, how much has changed for us since the stay-at-home orders have been in effect, and how I don't think we're to that point yet, but how quickly will we as a society start to disintegrate our morality?
Yeah.
And I think in some places you can see it already happening, and in some individuals, with these people who are out there with their signs and screaming in the faces of nurses because they don't want to stay home, they want to go out and get their hair cut. I mean, but how do we maintain that hope? How do we maintain that position of remembering that we belong to God, and that God created us to be in relationship with each other in a positive way and to build one another up, when we don't even know where our next meal is going to come from, or we don't know if we're going to survive until tomorrow because the Nazis might come and get us in the night, or we don't know if we're ever going to get out of our houses, or we don't know that any of the uncertainties of those kinds of situations where life is just in complete upheaval, not just for ourselves but for everyone around us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Tell Katie she's crazy and there's no way that this is true.
I was going to wait till the end of the study to say that.
Oh, okay. Do you have your dissertation against Katie in process?
I'm still working on it, yeah.
You'll publish that when it's all done.
Right.
That's fine. I will happily read that. Well, one other thing that I'll just toss out as something else you can chew on over the course of the next week, because it will come up, is the idea of determinism, which is that, the idea that God already knows everything that's going to happen and has determined what's going to happen. And so how do we understand how do we understand apocalypse? How do we understand apocalypse as telling the truth to the oppressed about what's happening now from God's perspective, but then at the same time believe that we have free will, we have power to act, God gives us space to respond to what is happening. And so the idea, especially as we get into the what could this mean for the future kind of stuff, how do we balance those two things? Does the existence of apocalypse mean that we have no control over anything that happens to us and that we're just pawns in God's big chess game? Or is there some role for us to play in making decisions and choices and how we respond to these events that are occurring? So we don't have to necessarily get into that today, but that's something that you can kind of chew on between now and next week and moving forward. And I got to tell you that Presbyterians love that question, because they're all about predestination and what's predestination and how does that work in relationship to free will and all that kind of thing. Lutherans don't talk about that quite as often, but this is a good opportunity to get into it a little bit and talk about, how do we, even as the people who have power in some situations, who are being prophesied to, told what the truth is as people of power and how we ought to be behaving, or this is going to happen, or as the people who have no power, who are the oppressed, who are suffering in a particular situation, how do we act? How do we decide how we're going to respond? Or do we get to decide how we're going to respond? Or has God already kind of determined all of that for us? So just a little light reflection for this week. Nothing too big.
Real light, huh?
Yeah. A little light reading.
All right. Anything else today?
Thought-provoking. Sorry I was late.
Nope, that's fine. Okay. Well, I think we can wrap it up for today then. Is there someone who would be willing to pray for us today? And especially pray for all these people who are looking at me like I just messed up their brains.
Like you're from Mars?
I will pray that everybody comes back next week after I did this to you. All right, well, I can do it this week. I've been lucky so far. I've gotten volunteers, but I can do it this week. Let's pray. Father of heaven and earth, we thank you for the people who have gathered together today and in these weeks. We thank you for the technology that you provide to us, the intelligence that you give to us as a society to create these technologies that can allow us to connect even during this time of separation. We pray that you would continue to be with us, continue to keep us healthy through this time. And we pray that you would give us insight and additional support as we continue to study the book of Daniel and all the challenges that it has. Thank you for all of the contributions of these amazing people and their ideas and the knowledge and wisdom that you've given to them. Pray that you would be with us all this week as we go about our activities, and that you would bring us all back next week as we continue to look at some more of the challenges that this book has to offer. Thank you, God, for all these things, and thank you for Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Katie.
Bye,
Have a
guys.
wonderful week. See you next week.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.